Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about language acquisition and we're going to get into the theories and language development. Let's go over the objectives for today's lesson. I'd like you to be able to distinguish between the theories that we're going to be discussing and also identify the theoretical relationship between the English language learner's first language and second language. Be able to describe the language acquisition process of monolingual, simultaneous bilingual and sequential bilingual children, determine which literacy concepts are transferable across languages, be able to explain different phenomena of bilingualism, and also use the language acquisition theories that we're going to cover today to explain linguistic errors in English that English language learners make and that you're going to be seeing in the writing samples that you're using for the assignment B. Okay, so let's get into our first language acquisition theory, which is behaviorism. And the main theorist of behaviorism is B.F. Skinner or Ivan Pavlov. And basically, behaviorism is based on three specific tenets. The first one being that learning is manifested by a change in behavior. So behaviorists believed that the outcome of learning had to be visible through actual behavior itself. And so this is why behaviorists like Skinner focused on observable changes, and he really ignored any possibility of processes occurring in the mind, because to him, if it wasn't observable through behavioral change, it really wasn't it wasn't anything that he could experiment with or research or study. The second tenet is that environment shapes behavior, and basically that behavior is the result of a person's response to a stimulus. And external stimuli could be manipulated to either strengthen or reduce an individual's behavior. And this is where we see this little cartoon here that says, the dog is saying, "Watch what I can make Pavlov do. As soon as I drool, he'll smile and write in his little book." And so there it's talking about how the stimulus and the response is sort of mirrored here in this little cartoon. So for example, the stimulus is Pavlov, is the dog drooling, and Pavlov is writing in his book as the response, right? But we know that in actual fact, in reality, the stimulus in Pavlov's sort of famous experiment was him ringing the bell and the dog drooling because the dog had associated the bell with the food that Pavlov was going to bring the dog. Okay, so this is how Pavlov studied behaviorism, and he studied stimuli and responses through that little experiment there. Okay, and then the third principle of the behaviorism is contiguity and reinforcement. And this is basically how close in time two events must be for a bond to be formed between those two events, right? So how close together does Pavlov need to ring the bell when he brings the dog the food in order for the dog to make a connection between the bell and the food, right? And then the response being the dog drooling. Another part of behaviorism is Skinner's operant conditioning. And this is made up of several different aspects or ideas. The first is positive reinforcement, which talks about responses. If you would like a response to continue happening, the idea is to reward that response. And that would make it likely that it happens again. Okay, so for example, good grades reinforce careful study. Okay, so that's a positive reinforcement. Good grades would be the positive reinforcement to make it more likely for the person to continue studying. Negative reinforcement represents responses that allow escape from painful or undesirable situations. Because you escape a painful or undesirable situation, you're likely not to... responses that allow escape from painful or undesirable situations are likely to be repeated again. So for example, being excused from writing a final because of the good work that you've been doing all along in the class. Extinction or non-reinforcement the idea behind that, to not reinforce the behavior, is that if you're not going to reinforce that particular activity or event, the likelihood of it occurring lessens, okay, because you're not reinforcing it. So that's the idea behind that. So that would be, for example, ignoring a student who calls out in class instead of raising their hand. And by ignoring that student, even though they're calling out, you are going to probably reduce their likelihood of doing that again, calling out, okay? Then when they would raise their hand, then you would want to positively reinforce that behavior by actually calling on that student. And then the last one is punishment, which are responses that bring painful or undesirable consequences. And so if a behavior is punished, then that the appearance of that behavior is likely going to decrease. Okay, so behaviorism exists in the psychology world, and parts of this were taken to try and explain language acquisition. And what we call this is verbal behaviorism. So they used these different tenets to try and describe how language development occurred and how language was acquired in particular. And so, for example, verbal behavior is simply behavior that is subject to the same controlling variables as any other operant behavior. So the context of a speaker's utterances is central to Skinner's perspective on language. So here we see the response to stimuli would be between the speaker and the listener. So if somebody asks you a question and you respond, the stimuli was the question, which then evokes the response. And this is pretty easily seen with children and parents. I'm going to play you a couple of clips that show how the stimuli evokes a response from the children. Right? So the parent provides the stimuli and the child repeats it and responds. And this is how language development at the early stages, part of it can be explained through this verbal behaviorism.
You love me too? It so sounds like I love you. I love you. I love you, sweet girl. It's the same thing every time.
Okay, so that was the first one. We see the baby repeating after the mother. The mother is saying, I love you, and the baby is trying to imitate it as much as possible. We see this also in this clip.
Hello. 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 Good boy. Oh.
And then we see the third one.
Hi, Dada. Hi, Dada. Hi, Dada. Hi, Dada. Hi, Dada. Hi, Dada. Hi, Dada.
Okay, so those are different examples of how behaviorism would be applied to language. But I want to go over some of the limitations with you, okay? Because this theory didn't really account for all of the different aspects of language development and language acquisition that we know today. So the first limitation was that verbal behaviorism didn't really account for novel utterances, such as the things that we would hear children say that adults would have never said to them. Things like hitted or good, right? The incorrect forms of verbs that they would have never heard adults repeat themselves. So the question with behaviorism is, how did this child come up with this sort of form of a linguistic form without having heard it before? Behaviorism doesn't really explain that. It also didn't explain how children developed the grammar system. So we know that when parents are raising their children, they don't necessarily teach them the rules of language or the grammatical rules, right? The grammatical rules are something that the child acquires on their own. However, under behaviorism, the idea is that everything is learned through behavior, right, and through response and stimuli. So that piece, the development of the grammar system, was not accounted for by behaviorism. And also, we see a resistance to reinforced corrections. So even though an adult might repeat time and time again the correct form, such as went rather than goed, and would correct the student, the child, sometimes we see that the child continues to make that error. And again, that really sort of goes against the response and stimuli and the contiguity and reinforcement pieces that behaviorism encompassed. So here are some examples of a stimuli and a response. Okay, so a child comes into the kitchen where a mother is and says, "I want milk," and the mother opens the refrigerator and gives the child milk. And so in that event, the child is learning about what saying "I want milk" will help the child to receive. Okay, and you can keep going. Teacher says to a student, "Behavior in German is verhalten." The student repeats, "Behavior is verhalten." The teacher says, "Correct." So here we can see that the student is learning a vocabulary word because the teacher is modeling it for the student, and the student is repeating it, right? So here, the stimuli is the teacher modeling the vocabulary word, and the response is the student repeating it correctly.